There's nothing quite like an Easter morning. The air is filled with the sounds of trumpets and timpani and with the wonderful aroma of Easter lilies. Flowers are everywhere in the place, even if they're not quite there outside. You know, clergy love this day. Just look at all of you here. You're here, many of you in your finest, and today at least you're not at home reading the newspaper or headed to the soccer game or to the grocery store. You're here in church where you belong. Probably the only people happier today than the clergy are the florists. I hear they call this the big one. In our service this morning, we're trying to capture some of what poet E.E. Cummings must have felt when he wrote his ecstatic poem that begins, "I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and blue, true dream sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes." Everything this morning is meant to say yes. Yes to the flowers of spring. Yes to the exuberant joy of our Easter music. Yes to the goodness woven into our lives. Yes to that great mystery of love who holds us all. But for some of us, it is just, there's not the same instinct immediately to be so exuberant. And there's a sense somehow that Easter joy could ring a little hollow. Many of us consider ourselves Christians, but a lot of us have cut some deals with the faith in order to be here. I can believe this and this, but that not so much. And when it comes to the resurrection, I know some just aren't so sure. It isn't that they write it off, it's just that they don't really know what to make of it. A few years ago, I talked to a newspaper reporter doing an article on what people actually believe about Easter. And he said his sense is that for many, including many Christians, Easter seems more like a fairy tale or wishful thinking. A wise theologian once said to me that he believed that many people in church would actually be more comfortable with Holy Saturday than Easter Sunday. They can believe in a good man now lying in a tomb, but they can't really trust this notion that a dead man is now alive and making a difference in the world. After all, life doesn't really look all the time like a great, big, exuberant yes. Love withers, wrinkles deepen. We're saying goodbye all our years. People we care for get sick and die. Children struggle. Marriages come apart. And we only have to gaze at the morning papers to wonder if yes is the right word for us. The heartbreaking events in Syria and Iraq as millions have been driven from their homes. The terrorist bombings that are haunting the cities of Europe and the U.S., the mean-spiritedness we're seeing in this presidential campaign as Muslims and Latino immigrants are being demonized and gravely threatened. With all the great trumpets of Easter morning, it's easy to forget, though, that the first Easter didn't begin with a resounding yes at all. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, give different accounts of what happened, but they all capture a sense of confusion and uncertainty on Easter morning, even when it dawns on the disciples that their Lord may be alive again. We don't hear then great cheers of joy, but rather fear and confusion and disorientation. Everything's happening in a half-light, and the disciples seem to have no proper scientific or mental categories to put this notion in of their master back beyond the tomb with them. In the account of Easter in Luke's Gospel we heard today, we see four women, disciples of Jesus, who were going with their spices to finish preparing Jesus' body for burial. And when they arrived, they were stunned to discover that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb and the body was gone. Then, stranger yet, they saw two mysterious men who looked as if they had emerged from some other realm, and the women were terrified. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" those men asked. "He is not here, but has risen." The women were stupefied. When they went back and told the rest of the disciples what they'd seen, the disciples dismissed the news as an idle tale. Then Simon Peter sprinted to the tomb to see for himself and was stunned when he saw the burial cloths folded up over at the side, having no relationship to anything going on. Luke says that all of them were amazed at what had happened, but we know they're also terribly confused. What exactly the disciples in the gospel accounts saw is often mysterious. But what we do know is that these followers of their Lord, who had just lived through the worst that life could bring, the devastating killing of their master, became utterly convinced that God had done something new, that death was no longer the finale to their story, that new, unimaginable life still lay before them, for Jesus himself, and for so many others. And it changed them from frightened, timid, often confused, often feckless followers into bold, risk-taking witnesses to what life can be, and we're ready to go out and tell everyone about it. Some might say that this talk of resurrection is actually a kind of poetic way of saying that Jesus' teaching and way of life live on. There are good principles to live by, like those of Socrates or the Buddha. Others would say that Easter talk is a language that should not be taken literally. That's important for a lot of the Bible when some of the things are quite strange and quite poetic and should not be literally taken. But this we're talking about now, this claim that this Lord came back from the dead and was present, is the linchpin of Christian faith and of the whole New Testament. God's power over death itself is finally at the heart of everything Christianity is about. Easter calls us to reframe how we see the world, to move beyond the space-time box that we are all trapped in this scientific age, and to imagine a greater dimension and a greater openness and a greater mystery of love that can be involved in our lives. If Christ be not raised from the dead, St. Paul wrote years later, then we are of all people most to be pitied. Of course, trusting resurrection isn't quick or easy for many. When I came back to Christian faith myself after my college years, it took some time for me to get my head and heart around this notion of resurrection. It took a good bit of Sunday worship and learning how to pray and watching resurrection happen in the lives of people I loved to begin to be able to trust that there is another dimension for sure. There is a dimension of love working through our world and through our lives. And because I learned to have contact with that in the worship of a place like this, I could begin to trust that there could be an eternity and there could be a power at work. I learned some things. I learned, for example, that there's a difference between resurrection and restoration. When someone or something in our lives dies, the promise is not that God will bring it back. When we lose a spouse or a job or our health, we're not promised that God will simply fix those things. Resurrection means that God can bring new surprising life out of what that has died. I remember when North Carolina writer Reynolds Price was devastated by a completely debilitating cancer that left him without the use of his legs. He wrote in his memoir, A Whole New Life, that at one point he had to decide that the old Reynolds Price is dead. It's time for a new one to begin. Sometimes we have to move toward the light while it's still dark. Sometimes we have to choose life while part of us is still feeling dead. Yes, a bright, enthusiastic yes may be too grand an affirmation for a world that's as complicated and as ambiguous as ours. But the great Swiss theologian Karl Barth gave us another way. He said that the good news of God in Christ has written on every page the word nevertheless. In a world like ours, terrible things happen, but they're never the last word. There's always God's nevertheless. And so he said the people of Israel were imprisoned in bondage to their evil Pharaoh. Nevertheless, God brought them out of slavery. A lame man had lain 30 years by the pool of Siloam. Nevertheless, Jesus healed him and gave him life. In all of these ways, there is a nevertheless that can break through. The disciples that came back and were terrified, thought everything was over. Nevertheless, they came and had strength again. The risen Christ appeared to them, nevertheless, and that gave them the strength to move on. My guess is that we've all known something of God's nevertheless. When we were sinking under the weight of worry or grief or the struggles of a child or in our own health or that of someone we love was under assault. When we saw that we were losing what we thought we had to have, somehow life came again. God wrote nevertheless across that page of our life, and we began again. History, too, is filled with dead ends and sealed tombs that miraculously were broken open. Almost no one imagined that the grip of communism had on Eastern Europe would loosen in anybody's lifetime. But in 1989, thanks to the Christian Polish Lech Wałęsa and Pope John Paul II and many others, it happened. One journalist writing about what happened in that year put it succinctly, couldn't happen, did. God's nevertheless was written across their lives. You see, if Christ is raised from the dead, then all bets are off. Easter declares it that God who created heaven and earth is capable of new creation, taking the broken pieces and the closed tombs of our world and our lives and making of them something fresh and new. And if Christ is raised from the dead, if nevertheless is God's answer to all that diminish our days, then you and I are called to watch the risen Christ, to see where Christ is at work, and to become partners and participants with him. There are families to be strengthened, relationships to be healed, children to be tutored, fair and hopeful responses to the needs of immigrants in our country to be found. A fine minister of the past generation, William Sloane Coffin, for many years chaplain at Yale and then at Riverside Church in New York, summed up the difference Easter should make this way. Christ is risen to convert us, not from life to something more than life, but from something less than life to the possibility of a full life. Christ's resurrection, he says, promises to put love in our hearts, decent thoughts in our heads, and a little more iron in our spines. this Easter morning says that Christ is among us. He's feeding us this morning with this bread and wine as he comes into our life. He'll be in our homes this afternoon, in our work tomorrow, opening doors and inviting us to risk and love with him. So look out for this sense of some call, some mysterious speaking to you in the heart of your soul to do something, be something, become something. Watch for the stirring of our risen Lord, here and everywhere. Watch for him writing, nevertheless, over your dead ends. We have much to hope for, much to discover, much to do, because Christ the Lord is risen.